Well, good evening and welcome back to Sunday Evening Devotions. Well, it's the beginning of fall and the seasons change. And yet in some way, while they change, they don't change. That is, the seasons come and go, the things still are the same, the colors change, the environment adjusts to the climate, and spring, summer, winter, fall, all those things come. So it's fall and the air is chilly. It kind of relates to our story tonight as we're thinking about Saul chasing David. You may remember that we left Saul, he was chasing David, and then he was called away because the Philistines had attacked Israel. And he was feeling somewhat guilty. But he returns again to his nature and comes after David in the wilderness of En-Gedi. Now, En-Gedi is that rocky territory between, in the southern part of Judah, between Judah and the Dead Sea. And so David is hiding in the rocks and fortresses. And in these chapters of 1 Samuel 24, 25, and 26, we're kind of like bookends. 24 and 26 are similar stories where David is confronted by Saul and refuses to kill him. And then in 25 is a central story about Nabal. So what happens? Well, in the case of the first story in chapter 24, David is hiding in the cave, and Saul is chasing and going after him where he's been heard that David is hiding. And he inadvertently enters into this very same cave that David is hiding. David sneaks up upon Saul and cuts the corner of his robe off. And as Saul leaves, he tells Saul, "Hey, Saul, listen, I was in there and I could have taken your life, but I didn't. My men wanted me to. I could be relieved of the troubles that you're causing me. And here's the corner of your robe to prove it." Saul was overcome with grief and guilt and admits that he has no reason to be after David and that David is an honorable man. And so they depart. Then in 26, a similar thing. Saul again is after David, this time in the wilderness of Ziph, similar territory, but closer to the land of Judah. And again, at this point, David finds out where Saul is, and at night, David sneaks into the camp. Someone wants to kill him. David says, "No, we can't do that. He's the Lord's anointed." But he takes Saul's spear and his water jug, which is near his head, and then leaves. In the morning, he announces that he's been there and has the evidence, and again, Saul is come with guilt. So Saul changes and vacillates. He's an unstable man, unstable in all of his ways. He's doubting God's promises. He is now estranged from God himself. And we find this back and forth with Saul, where he feels guilty, he struggles, and yet his purpose really is to reject God and God's promises. Well, in the middle of this story is the third story, which is in 1 Samuel 25. David and his men, needing to find ways to supply themselves and to provide for themselves, protected the people of Israel from their enemies, sometimes the Philistines and sometimes the Bedouins, the ones who would come as raiders across the way and steal from the Israelites. Again, you have to think that Israel was not in a very good situation. Their king was not taking care of them nor watching out for them and guarding them from their enemies, but was really chasing after David most of the time. So David was standing guard for this particular man who was a wealthy man who had lots of sheep and oxen and all. And so David's men had watched over them while they were watching their herds and their sheep out in the fields. And so at the time of sheep shearing, when he was gathering in the wool from the sheep and rejoicing and celebrating, David sent his men to receive a gift for what David had done. And this man, Nabal, we find out, is a very hard-hearted man. He's also, in the Bible, called a fool. And he says, "Well, who is David, and why should I care?" And he turns David's men away. Well, David is angry about this because his men had been sent by him to care for people of Israel, and particularly Nabal, and yet he's being rebuffed. And so he's determined to have vengeance, to defend his name. And what happens is that Nabal's wife then steps in, and she sends a gift to David and comes to him and says, listen, my husband is acting as a fool, and he doesn't understand what you've done, but I know that God is blessing you. So in the midst of all this, we have a couple things. David is being confirmed even to the people of Israel that he is blessed by the Lord and that he is God's servant. He's also having to patiently wait, but God provides for him. So when this woman then returns back to Nabal, well, he hears all these things and he is stricken with a stroke and he dies. And then she is taken as David's wife after she grieves and mourns the loss of her husband. And she quickly aligns herself with David, as many people are. God is slowly drawing people together for David. So what do we learn about this? Well, God doesn't change, and men vacillate, but what David was learning was patience and trust in the Lord. He was learning to depend upon God's provision. He was learning to wait upon the Lord. Yeah, he could have acted rudely and out of anger and passion, but that wouldn't make him succeed. What would make him succeed was trusting in God's timing, in God's ways. And so he does. And in this way, he's a type of Christ. Rejected by many, received by some, waiting in God's timing, and in all that suffering, knowing that God will work out his perfect plan. David points us to Jesus, who protects his people despite being rejected, despite being despised. David is showing us that we're going to be God's servants. We're going to have to trust in him in all things and in his timing, and not take things into our own hands. And in particular, in David's case, when he was tempted to sin, God sent someone to stand before him to stop him. And we can trust in God to care for us, to direct our lives. Because, well, that's why Jesus has come. Jesus has come to stand in our place, to keep us, to protect us, and to bring us home. Well, that's good news. Good night.